from Dr. Maria Paez Victor.
Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me? Yeah. Is it okay? Oh.
Yes.
Well, if we take a quick look at world history, the most significant alliances between countries have been made for the purpose of war. In recent history, the European Union was established with very laudable and lofty ideals of cooperation. But its results was the strengthening of the market for corporations, not the welfare of the European people. Two powerful institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, were established for supposedly generous purposes of facilitating credit for developing nations. Sadly, in practice, their neoliberal policies resulted in not so generous consequences, in overwhelming national debts and the imposition of austerity policies that impinged on the sovereignty of countries to decide their own domestic affairs and brutally deteriorated the social services for their people. Now the European Union Bank has followed in the steps of the IMF and the World Bank with respect to the European nations that have the weaker economies. Thus, we have all witnessed the staggering effects of their power on Spain, on Greece, on Italy, on Portugal, on Ireland, and even in the population of England and Germany that have been affected. And some of the results have been quite terrible. Socioeconomic inequalities have been rising in the European Union, being higher today than in 1980. 23% of European people, that's 11.5 million people, are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. In a recent report, the Red Cross pointed to a massive rise in poverty in the European Union, such that it is facing catastrophic economic and social decline. Those are their words. It links this to the austerity measures that have snowballed poverty and unemployment. And as poverty increased, social services have been reduced. And there has been a 75% increase in suicides in Europe just between 2009 and 10. In Spain, where the unemployment rate is 25%, that's 1/3 of all the unemployed in Europe, suicides are at 7.6% per 100,000 people. Those are thousands of people. And in Greece, suicides have increased by 40%, a 50-year high. That's almost a suicide a day in Greece. So for every 1% of fall in government spending led to a 0.4% increase in suicides among Greek men. And even in England, suicide rates have risen 4%, and it's linked to the economic inequality crisis. And in the United States, poverty has increased every year for the past decade by 14%. That is 45 million people in the United States that are poor, and that's not counting the 12 million who are illegal immigrants. The bottom 90% of their citizens are poorer than they were in 1987. And again, suicide is now the leading cause of death in the United States. Now, all of that was the bad news. Now comes the good news. The good news is, as has been stated here, in Latin America. Let's see what's happened in this decade in Latin America, the very same decade. Latin America as a whole, and the ALBA countries in particular, are a beacon of hope, an example of social peace and well-being for the world, an example of what real international solidarity looks like. I have to quote our Latin American Pope, who actually believes in liberation theology, and he said, "Economic liberalism leaves the poor people for the trash can." And that's exactly what the ALBA nations have not done. ALBA, founded by Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, set out to help its member countries to work together in harmony, to be independent of the US empire by finding an alternative to corporate control of their economies. ALBA is a cohesive alternative vision of what international trade and mutual help should be, based on complementarity and solidarity, not domination and exploitation. And it relies on that egalitarian relationship between countries, respecting each country's sovereignty, respecting each country's culture and development path, while focusing on trying to meet the real needs of the people, like Professor Keith has just said. ALBA is this humanitarian alliance. It doesn't have an equal in the world, yet it doesn't act in isolation, but hands in hands with the other organizations that it actually helped to create, which are the skeleton of the regional integration, CELAC, UNASUR, MERCOSUR, Banco del Sur. And I'd just like to quote what the ALBA countries said at the onset. They said, "We agree to convert our countries not into zones of free trade, but in zones free of hunger, illiteracy, misery, and marginalization." And some of the achievements which have already been talked about, but I just want to talk about some of them, is the same decade that all those things are happening in Europe, they helped 70 million people out of predatory trade relationships imposed by the US and the corporate elite. They have solidified a Latin American bloc that is anti-imperialist and anti-neoliberal. And it's acting together internationally in international forums so as not to be victims of bullying and extortion. This is very important politically. It has solidified the South-South trade cooperation with no strings attached. In the last 7 years, ALBA has raised 11 million people out of poverty. In Bolivia and Ecuador and Venezuela, poverty was cut by half. They have eradicated illiteracy with the Cuban Yo Si Puedo method, increasing literacy to an incredible 96% in the ALBA countries. And as for training physicians in Latin America, with the free medical school in Cuba and Venezuela, they have trained about 23,000 doctors. Now, how come if Cuba... I'd like someone to tell me, how come if Cuba and Venezuela, who are very small economies compared to Canada, why can't we have free medical schools in Canada? When we need doctors, and yet it is very expensive to be a doctor in Canada. And Mission Milagro, which has already been spoken about, has returned the miracle of eyesight to 3.5 million people free of charge. Why can't we do these things? So one of the wonderful things that ALBA has done is that it's given care to 1.3 million disabled people. Disabled people, these are people who used to be, hidden away in the attics, in the corners of the houses. There was nothing to do with them. There was nothing to help with them. Now you should see the wonderful care that people with handicaps have. These objectives, how were they met? Well, they were met first through direct exchanges, like Doctors for Oil between Cuba and Venezuela, for example, implementing their own currency, which Juan was just talking about, sucre, which liberates them from having to get dollars. Up to now, there have been more than $700 million worth of transactions using the sucre. And some countries have asked to use the sucre even if they're not members of ALBA. And the ALBA Bank, which means they don't have to go begging to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or the European Bank. Loans and exchanges in ALBA recognize each country's strengths and it allows them to set their own development objectives in a more sustainable and a more equitable way than if they ask loans to these international organizations. There's Petrocaribe. Petrocaribe sells oil to the ALBA countries at a market price, but they only pay 50% up front, 25% over 20 years at 2% interest, plus 25% is invested in joint poverty reduction programs. And I don't know, this makes the right wings in Venezuela they just go nuts. They keep saying, Venezuela's giving away, its oil. The grand enterprises are really important because these are public enterprises that are jointly owned by the government. So they're public enterprises jointly owned by all of the countries. And they work in the areas of greatest need: food security, environment, science and technology, and I love this one, just commerce. I think we should all repeat that whenever we're talking with people. Just commerce, energy, industry, telecommunications, transportation. And for example, there's ALBA-Tel to establish radio stations in remote areas, ALBA Med to produce cheaper medicines, ALBA Culture to protect the cultural heritage of Latin America, ALBA Sports to help students and children train. And another interesting aspect of ALBA is that it is committed to safeguarding the environment, as John was speaking about, to protect the biodiversity and the ecosystems, to fight climate change. ALBA has forcefully declared the following, and this is a beautiful, beautiful principle. Nature is our home and is the system of which we form part, and therefore it has infinite value, but it does not have a price, and it is not for sale. So ALBA, especially with the leadership of Evo Morales, has really taken a very central role internationally to protect the planet. Now, it is noticeable how increasingly spokespersons for the United States include in their diatribes barbs against the ALBA countries, because it is a threat. It's a threat to the powerful because it allows lesser states to have strong, effective, and efficient governments, and therefore they strive to keep them weak and dependent and compliant. And ALBA is definitely in their crosshairs because it is a state-centered instrument that is linked to the social movement to counter weakness and dependency. Now, ALBA is an original project, but it has deep historical roots in the ideals of its liberators and its indigenous leaders, which Professor Keith brilliantly was talking about. It breaks the mold of previous relationships between nations, and it is an alternative to the capitalist thrust to weaken the state infrastructure and to increase privatization of public spheres. And I love to repeat what the famed sociologist Eric Hobsbawm said. You know, he warned of the threatening rise of the power of corporations and the erosion of the public sphere, which is the only place where true democracy can flourish, in the public sphere. And Hobsbawm said that the future will depend on restoring public authorities that guard the public interest. And that is what ALBA countries are doing. They're linking their governments and their social movements together to defend the public interest, their sovereignty and democracy, and helping each other to increase the happiness of their people. And some more good news. Luciano Valpolo, the Italian coordinator of the Network of Intellectuals and Artists in Defense of Humanity, which they met in Havana, has recently said in La Habana that the countries of Southern Europe, plus Ireland, should create an association similar to ALBA, a Mediterranean ALBA. Some are even talking about European Chavismo. The leaders of both Spain's Podemos and Greece's Syriza are both friends of the Bolivarian Revolution, and it will not be long when they also start looking to ALBA for a way towards genuine solidarity between nations. And it's about time that Europeans cast aside their Eurocentrism and look south to ALBA, where there is a new dawn for human development through genuine international solidarity and cooperation. Thank you very much, all of you.